It's lesson 8. Landon. And we're going to start looking at verse 38 is where we'll be. And we're going to continue to look at the miracles of Elisha, as we looked at a couple of them last week. And we're going to look at, I think, 6 of them we have. Probably won't get through all 6 of them. May try to get 3 of them done today. And as we continue to see some of the things that remember how many, not to guess necessarily put a number on it, but how many miracles or great things that Elisha performed compared to Elijah. I mentioned it last week. Do you remember? Twice as many, right? And what was the reasoning for that? Because he asked for a double portion, right? We asked for a double portion of God's blessing on him. And we're going to see physical evidence of that God did in fact bless him with the double portion because of that. All right, so we're going to start in verse 38, and this is more of a historical record here of some of the things that Elisha did. Now, these are not arranged in any type of chronological order. All right, so as we look at these 6 things through these couple of chapters, don't think this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. That's not necessarily the case. They are more so arranged, 2 Kings, according to his private dealings with individuals, and then secondly, some of the public activities that he dealt with the nations of Israel and the nation of Syria. Oh,
can see it if we can
up and to the left. Keep going, left, straight. Hop, click. That's why you're the man back here, Landon. All right, so we're going to see some faith here that was being used in Elisha's life. And there are 6 of these that we're going to be looking at. I need to go back. And we're going to start by looking at faith brought from transformation in the first 3 verses here. So, again, these are not miracles of Elisha, not set up in a chronological order, but more so in the fact that he starts off dealing with individuals. Some of the private stuff that he did do not occur exclusively within the reign of because he only reigned for about 12 years, and Elisha's ministry lasts for right around 56 years. Okay, and that includes the time he spent under Elijah. And as we're going to continue to see with these 6 miracles that he kind of performs, that we're going to be looking at, that we're going to continue to be reminded of the benefit that comes from faith. Right? There are benefits for us as Christians in putting our faith and having our faith in God. And we're going to see 6 of those benefits today that God presented to Israel. And we're going to start in verse 38 and seeing that faith, first of all, brought forth through transformation. Now, here's a map of kind of where we're at right now, and starting in verse 38. And this is Gilgal, is where this miracle or this godly act of wonder kind of takes place. And this is kind of the other places around the area that Elisha's kind of be dealing with as we look at these 6 different things that he did. Okay, now the first example that we're going to look at in verses 38 down to verse 41 is God responding to the faith of Elisha while there was, and the sons of the priests sitting before him said not. So they poured out for the men to eat, and it came to pass as they were eating of the pottage that they cried out and said, O thou man of God, there is death in the pot, and they could not eat thereof. But he said, Then bring meal, and he cast it into the pot, and he said, Pour out for the people that they may eat. and there was no harm in the pot. So we see the first example here of this Elisha's faith is we see the sons of the prophet one more time. We've seen these individuals, these groups of individuals several times now throughout as we've been looking through both Elijah's and Elisha's life. But the sons of the prophets were there, and they were gathered listening to Elisha's instructions, there to receive some teaching or some tutelage, I guess, from Elisha. And he asked his servants, or one of the servants, to make dinner, essentially, to cook a stew, to cook some soup, and to make it for them so that they could eat. Now, during this time, this was an existing famine that was happening in the land, and because of the famine, the ingredients for this stew or this soup would not just been an abundance of stuff around to throw into the pot. Okay, so what one of the students did was he went out and found some herbs and some wild gourds, and I'm sure they looked pretty good, probably looked very healthy or whatever it was. It probably wasn't much around, so he grabbed those things, cut them up, and put them into the soup for them to eat. Now, when the men that were there tasted the soup, they quickly found out that what? It was poison, right? And it was no good. The soup was no good to eat at all. As a matter of fact, they cried out, Elisha, there's death, there's poison, there's death in this pot. If we continue to eat this, it's not going to be good for us at all. So it wasn't edible, probably didn't taste good, and it was also had some poison in it as well. Then we get to verse 41, though, and we see what happened in verse 41. What did Elisha do? He put meal into it, right, and cast that into the pot. And then the bad gourd became then edible. So the stew that was non-edible, that was poisonous, took a little meal and threw in there. And meal, if we take back and we look at the chemical composition of meal, which I did for us this week, there is nothing in it that has any type of anti-poison at all. Okay? It's not one of those things you can, it's not a something poisonous in it into something that was not poisonous and probably even tasted good, right? Let's imagine God probably did that as well. And it reminds us of another miracle, right? What is another miracle that happened in the New Testament where we had an actual physical transformation of something? Turning the water into wine, right? So John chapter 2. And leave your place there back in 2 Kings. We're going to be coming back to it, of course. So let's go to John chapter 2. And let's look at these 11 verses, right? The miracle of Jesus turning the water into wine. On the third day, there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus the mother of Jesus saith unto him, they have no wine. And Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? The hour is not yet come. His mother said unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And they said, pots, of stone, after the manner of the purifying of Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. And Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. And when the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, which men have well drunk, then that which is worst, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. The beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. So we see another example here of a physical change of something, right? A physical changing of one thing into another because of the power of God. So we see it the same thing we see in 2 Kings reminds us of this same showing Christ or showing God's transformative power. Now, looking back on it and understanding that the turning of water into wine was a physical illustration, right, of Jesus' spiritual ability to change a person's heart. That's why we see that miracle there. and changing the heart at the point of salvation. And because of that, many of Jesus' followers put their faith in him because of the miracle. Now, God still's transforming hearts, right? Saving people and saving faith. And that is a far greater miracle and a far greater thing than just simply transforming bad gourds into good gourds for us to eat. That he actually has the ability to transform us as people into people who are more like him. So we see the first one here of this Elisha's brought transformation. We see the first one again, if I can go back, bringing forth his faith, bringing forth transformation, an embodiment or an example of the same transformation power that Christ has in our lives as well. The second one we see is faith bringing fullness, and this is in verses 42 down through verse 44. Now, this is a little bit later on, so some time has passed here, and we again see these needy sons of prophets needing something to eat. Right? So go to verse 42 with me, please, of 2 Kings. And there came a man from Baal Shalisha, and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and full ears of corns in the husk thereof. And he said, Give unto the people that they may eat. And his servitor said, What should I set this before 100 men? And he said again, Give the people that they may eat. For thus saith the Lord, They shall eat, and shall leave thereof. So we set it before them, and they did eat, and left thereof according to the word of the Lord. So a little bit of time has passed. The sons of the prophets need food again. This man from Baal Shalisha shows up and gives an offering of what he has to Elisha. Now, this offering that he had was what he had just simply left over, right? No, right? What's it say? What's it say in verse 42? That he came and he brought the man of God what? The bread of the first fruits. Right? So the very first thing that he had, the first fruits, is what he gave to Elisha to give to the people. Now, this offering of these first fruits included grain that the owner had harvested, as well as barley that he had harvested, to make loaves of bread made from the grain. And according to the law over in Leviticus, and these people would have known this, that the first fruits of everything belongs to whom? To God, right? The first fruits belong to God. And then those first fruits were then eaten by the priests. Okay, that's kind of the law of the land. The man most likely saw Elisha as the closest representative to a priest that he knew. And its closest representative to God that he knew. Therefore, he took his first fruits and offered them to Elisha. Now, we see that happening. What role here does faith play in giving of one's first fruits to God? What role does faith play? What role does faith play of offering the first fruits to God? Trusted God for all of his provisions, right? And that's essentially why God has asked, or why the requirement of the first is there. The person is exercising faith that God is going to allow them to bring in the rest of the harvest, right? He will allow them to bring in everything else, all the grain, and that grain, what was left over, would be more than sufficient to meet the needs. If you're offering up the first fruits to God, then you're not worried about having enough left over for you. And that's exactly what happens here. That the man had even came to Elisha and given any grain at all during this time of famine shows the faith of this guy. But he actually brought the very first fruits of his harvest during this really bad famine that was going on, showing that he had faith that God would take care of him in his family moving forward. Okay, the man was full because the man's faith was full because he honored God with his first fruits. He served God with what he had, and sure that he was doing exactly what God had wanted for him to do as well. Okay, this service, this giving of his first fruit, and then how God blesses it was a small task or a small thing that happened. But he was also showing his faith in what God could do for his family and also for the people of Israel if they repent as well and worship God in the way that they were supposed to. All right, over in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, don't flip over there. But God gave a promise to Israel that if they honored the law of the first fruits, lived by faith, and were obedient to Him, God promised them something. And do you remember what God promised the nation of Israel if they would remain faithful to honoring Him? In Exodus, it says that the Lord is going to specifically says that they would never lack or want for anything if they were honoring of God. So the man's first fruits here that he gave was a generous offering, but it was not enough to feed the people that were gathered here. Okay, he came and said, "I'll give you what I got," but Elisha saw that there was not going to be enough to feed all of these people that were there. So, we see in verse 43, that Elisha, seeing that, and his servitor said, "What should I do with this?" Set it before the 100 men. And he said again, "Give the people they may eat, for thus saith the Lord, they shall eat, and they shall leave thereof." So, by faith, Elisha says, take the food, start handing it out. Start giving to the people that are there. And his faith multiplied the barley bread so that the prophets were too full to even eat what was there for them to eat. Okay. Actually, you see in verse 44, so he set it before them, and they did eat and left thereof according to the word of the Lord. There's actually so much food there that these guys ate till they were full, and there was stuff left over. For them. And much like an example of Jesus' disciples, right, gathering up the leftover barley bread after Jesus fed the 5,000 over in John chapter 6. Right, we know that story very well. And there was more stuff left over after all those people had eaten. Exact same miracle kind of happened here with Elisha. That these guys ate till they were full and there was stuff left over. Now, this miracle that was performed has both a physical and a spiritual application for us today. God still provides for believers. God still provides for believers' physical needs. God still provides for believers' spiritual needs as they faithfully and sacrificially serve Him. Salvation for our souls. So we see faith bringing fullness through Elisha as well. And there's a point here when it wants us to kind of think back and reflect maybe on times in our lives where God has met our needs farther even than what we expected Him to. And I'm sure if we actually took time and we went around today, you would all have an instance, probably multiple instances, in which there's been times where you don't do. And then God's always come through and always met, probably even above and beyond what was even needed. And that comes from lives that are lived faithfully and sacrificially to Him. God's promised that He's going to do that, and He will always do that, and we can always count on Him to do that as well. Let's look at one more of these, and then we'll be done for today. This one's a little bit longer. Over in 2 Kings chapter 5, and we see faith brought by recuperation. Okay, recuperating, getting better after being sick in some way. This is the story of Naaman. And we probably have heard the story of Naaman before. But we're going to take chapter 5 here and look at a couple of things of Naaman. This was taking place in Damascus, the capital of Syria. Okay, up there at the very top of that, by the Abinadab River. As you can see up here, this is kind of where Elisha is at now. And Naaman, as we're going to see, had leprosy. Okay? And Naaman's leprosy was probably quite a bit different than the modern leprosy that we see today. What we see today is Legionnaire's disease. is the modern form of leprosy, and it's pretty not as prevalent as it was in old times, but in some of the third world countries, Legionnaire disease is a real thing that people deal with. But this was probably a little bit different that Naaman had. His disease would have probably devastated him and eventually just completely taken his life. Legionnaire disease now to die from this. Okay, this leprosy was going to kill him. So in Damascus, the capital city of Syria, Naaman had this big problem. Look at verse 1 of chapter 5. Now Naaman, who wasn't just any old like average Joe, right? It says Naaman was what? The captain, right? The captain of the host of the king of Syria. So this was an important individual. All right, had a lot of power. People knew. Was probably well respected. He was a very, very important man. So he was the captain of the host of the king of Syria, and it says, a great man with his masters, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but, as the end of verse 1 says, he was a leper. Okay, so this is Naaman, really important person here. Top dogs army. Everybody knew, everybody respected him. He was a good man, but he had fallen to a leprosy. Now, there had been all throughout this, as we've been studying these divided kingdoms now for the last several weeks, the whole time these kingdoms are divided, there is constant battle, constant skirmishes, constant things going on between Israel and Syria. Okay, there are always little fights, always little breakouts that are always happening. Even though there had been, we've seen this official peace treaty that they had been agreed upon several years previously to this, there was still constant little battles going on all the time. And in one of those raids, the Syrians captured a young Jewish girl that had made her a slave to be named, or had made her a slave, to Naaman's wife. And this little girl that we're going to meet here in a second, testimony about Elisha as being a healer to kind of what happens here. Right? So verse 2, and the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captives out of the land of Israel, a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. All right, so this little girl had been captured, little Jewish girl had been captured by the Syrians, and she became a slave to Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress in verse 3, what would God my Lord? So the little girl who then came back saw Naaman, saw his leprosy, and what did she tell Naaman's wife? Verse 3, what'd you tell him? He needed to be healed, and what else? I know the guy, right? I know the guy. We need to get in here to help him. Okay? So Elisha, as we can see, what we're seeing now is Elisha's far-reaching influence on the people around him. His godliness, because of his faithfulness, is now influencing a whole lot of people. This is just one dude that is influencing all of these people because of his faithfulness in the way God was working through him. So we got this little Jewish girl that's been captured. She sees Naaman, sees his leprosy. She goes to his wife, says, I know the guy that can fix this. Okay, I know the guy that we need to get in here. So verse 4, and one went in and told us the Lord, saying, Thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. So they go in and they tell Naaman. Verse 5, And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed, and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him from his leprosy. And it came to pass in verse 7, when the king of Israel read the letter, he rent his clothes and said, Am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover man of leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. So, we now see that Naaman hears this, and here's the little girl, here's what she's saying, and the reaction that he has to this little girl is, take action and thought God go and get him here. So, assuming the prophet that the little slave girl was talking about was a subject of the king of Israel, the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, sends a message with Naaman to the king of Israel to get the prophet to heal Naaman. Okay? So Joram the king was so upset, so distraught by this letter from the king of Syria that he tore his robe and rent his clothes and assumed, as we saw in verse 7, that Ben-Hadad was attempting and trying to pick a fight with him or to start a war with him, just like he'd done with King Ahab. Now, the news of Jehoram's anxiety and his worry about this fight coming with the king of Syria quickly reached to Elisha. Verse 8, and it was so that when Elisha, the man of God, had heard the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. All right, so Elisha hears that, tells the king to send Naaman to his house, to Elisha's house, and then Naaman comes and shows up in Elisha's house. And we get to verse 9. So Naaman has now came to Elisha's house, and he's there, and he's expecting or knows that Elisha probably has the ability to cure him of his leprosy. Verse 9, So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariots and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come unto thee again, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth and went away and said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. All right, so let's stop right here for just 1 second. So we have Naaman who comes to the house of Elisha, standing outside. Elisha sends his messenger, sends his servant out to Naaman, and he gives Naaman some instructions. And what are the instructions that he gives Naaman? What's he say? Go to the Jordan River and do what? Jump in 7 times, right? Go in and jump in and wash himself 7 times. When you do that, the leprosy will be healed. Your flesh will be come back to you. Now, so we have Naaman, who's traveled quite some time, probably in quite a bit of physical distress because of his leprosy, shows up at Elisha's house. He's traveled all this way, expecting this guy to heal him in some way, and then Elisha gives him some very specific instructions. What's Naaman's response? He didn't like it, right? He was upset about the instructions given to him. As a matter of fact, he even says he was wroth in verse 11 and left and went away from the place because he said, I thought surely this guy's going to come out, he's going to lay his hands on me, he's going to pray over me, he's going to do whatever it is, and I'm going to be healed, okay? Which was not the case. Now, just take a quick second here. Let's consider ourselves in this situation. You've had this little slave girl that you've captured. She's probably in distress. Probably thinking of a way, maybe this will help me save my life. Tells Naaman to go find Elisha. Naaman, probably in the back of his mind, thinks, I'll give it a try. Why not? So eventually gets to the place where he meets Elisha. Now, if he's traveled this far, he's going to give this, whatever it may be. I think that if I'm in this situation, right, if I'm Naaman here, I'm probably going to go do what? I'm going to at least go give it a try, right? I've been dealing with this sickness and this illness for how long, whatever it is. I'm going to go to the Jordan River, and I'm going to at least give it a whirl. Naaman doesn't. Right? He's upset by the fact that Elisha didn't just walk out in him. Verse 12, Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all of the waters of Israel? So, we see the Jordan River, which is where? All the way down here. Okay? We see that, we know that he says that the 2 rivers that are closer to his home, right, closer to where he is at, the Abana River and the Pharpar River, he says, are these rivers not better than what the Jordan River should be? Why can't I just go to these rivers, which are much closer? They're not going to be near as far as me to have to travel. Are they not better for me to go in and to wash off? And it says, that the last part of verse 12, May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and he went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spake unto him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean. So he gets mad, says, these rivers are closer, why can't I use these rivers? So he storms off and leaves. His servants come back to him and say, God, Naaman, if he would have told you to do some crazy thing, right? Hop around and pat your belly 13 times and sing a song and dance, would you not have done it? And Naaman says, well, yeah, probably. I would have done about whatever he asked me to do. If he'd have told you to build an altar and to sacrifice whatever it may have been or to dance or whatever, would you not have done it? Whatever crazy thing he asked you to do, would you not have done it? And he said, well, yeah, probably. So why not do something simple as simply do what the man says, is what they tell Naaman. So we get to verse 14. Then he went and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, and his flesh came like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So he gets brought to his sins by his servants. He goes to the Jordan River, does as Elisha says for him to do, and his health is completely restored. Now, verse 15, we're going to finish right here with this, and we'll get into the rest of this next week. And he returned to the man of God, he and all of his company, and came and stood before him and said, Behold, now I know there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. Verse 16 as well. But he said, As the Lord liveth before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So Naaman returns to Elisha, acknowledges that Jehovah is the only true God that's worthy of any type of sacrifice at all. And Naaman is prepared to reward the prophet. Right? Give him a lot of stuff here. Lavishly reward him for the fact that he was able to help him get healed. Elisha refuses the gifts. Okay? His only desire is that Naaman acknowledges the fact that a true prophet lives in Israel. Okay? But the problem with this is that's not the end of this story. All right, there are some more things that are going to happen here. And Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, who has been pretty faithful to this point, he has some different ideas that he's going to kind of get into. So as we get into that later on, let's stop right there and get into that next week. So we see again with Elisha continuing to be faithful. God is working through him in mighty ways. People know Elisha, know he's a one true prophet. Lives are being changed. People are being influenced. And it's not because Elisha is any great, strong, wonderful, will-powered man. It's just the fact that Elisha was willing and faithful. Right? And I would imagine if we were able to talk to Elisha today, if we could bring him up here on the stage, he would be the first person to say, it's nothing that I did. It wasn't the fact that I was, raised in a certain way or whatever it may have been the case, whatever you may think. It was just the fact that he was willing and faithful. Right? His faithfulness, God double portioned his spirit. He was able to do great and mighty things, and people's lives changed because of it. So it's a lesson to us. Right? We don't have to be the whatever it may. We don't have to be this outwardly this huge, well-known person to have any type of influence at all. We have our influence by being willing and faithful. That's where we see the influence on the people who are around us, and how we can be a light for Christ, and how we can be faithfully serving Him and see other people's lives changed if we are simply willing and faithful to do whatever God asks of us. All right, so next week we'll finish up with this lesson. We'll see what happens here with Naaman and Elisha, and look at a couple more miracles that Elisha performs as well. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson. Thank you for the fact of being able to look at Elisha's life and seeing his faithfulness and seeing the influence because of his faithfulness as well. And that leads us and sees us, Lord, that we can see the importance of living a life that is faithful and honoring and pleasing unto you as well. We say we want to be effective. We say we want to be witnesses, Lord. There's no greater way for us to do that than living a life that is obedient to you. So I pray that's the desire that we have. And that continues to be our desire as well, Lord. As we continue to look at these lessons, continue to look at some of these instances, that just gives us more fuel for the fire of living a life according and honoring and pleasing unto you. Lord, for Pastor Rob as well as he comes in the next hour, that you'll just use him, that you'll keep us attentive, Lord, to the words that he has, just with our ears
well, and that you just use him in a mighty way. Allow it to be an influence